And there we go. So hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you may happen to be. I am, got down a little bit. This is still too red. Oh well, it's all right. It makes me look like I'm still alive. And that's a good look, I think, for a live reading. Anyway, hello, hi. Good to see you all, or not to see you, but to feel your presence, to absorb the gestalt of everybody gathered together. I am here to read and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum. So anyway, what's been going on this week? I'm just working. I'm deep in several books all at the same time, although this week it's kind of narrowed down to being at work on both halves of what used to be The Navigator's Children and is now into The Narrow Dark and The Navigator's Children. But so I'm working with both of those at the same time. Fortunately now, finally, Brothers of the Wind has largely, I just suddenly remembered I have to do acknowledgments and stuff. But other than that kind of thing, Brothers of the Wind has passed from my purview. And I am no longer working with it, so I'm down to just two extremely long books that I'm juggling it because they're at different stages of completion. Anyway, but I started to get feedback from various friends, including some of the people who frequent this reading slot at 2 o'clock in the morning, my time. And all the words on the new book so far have been good, although obviously they were helping me out by telling me where I had messed things up or where things didn't work or whatever. And get the same help from Deborah, of course, who not only is my buddy and my partner, but Deborah was my British publisher when we first met. And to begin with, our relationship was purely business, and she was a really, really good publisher and a really good editor. So I have her too, and it hasn't even reached my actual publishers, who are also very, very good. And they will then be administering the coup de grace to the manuscript in terms of saying, yes, that's all very good, but this bit still sucks, or whatever. I mean, they never, Betsy and Sheila never give me that kind of feedback, obviously, because they know I would burst into tears and go running out of the house. I don't like my book. No, I don't do that. Not recently. Not in the last couple of novels, anyway. So, anything else to report? No, we are just doing the stuff here. We are still trying our best to observe the pandemic stuff and wear masks out of the house and all that, although we are now taking them off in restaurants to eat, which is wild and daring with the Delta variant flittering around. But other than that, let me think. Yeah, and just trying to do the normal stuff of life. Keep the place somewhat under control, which is always difficult when you have as many people and animals living in a place as we have. So anyway, so that's the story. I don't really have much else to tell at the moment in terms of any useful information. So let me check in and see who has popped by to say hello. And there is my good old friend Olaf. Good to see you, Olaf. Rosalba, nice to see you. Chris, good morning. Wouter, good morgen. And Cliff, hello Cliff. Yes, me and mine are doing well. We're all good here. I hope the same is true for you. James, hello James. Welcome aboard. Holger, good morning and sunny greetings from Waldesruhe. And a bear costume. A bear costume? Oh, you're talking about my outfit, my poodle shirt. That's what Deb calls them. I now have two of them. I have a black one and a gray one, and they're very good actually for. We're not having a heat wave here. Considering it's July, it's still like putting on a hoodie or something to sit outside weather. So, but we're close to the ocean, relatively close to the ocean, which probably has something to do with it. So anyway, not a bear costume, just a tad costume. Although if I wasn't straight, I probably would be a bear, but that's a whole different story. Iris, good to see you. Carol, good morning. Lockdown reading Tales of Genji and Minor Sense of the Scythian Norns. No, the Tale of Genji was not direct inspiration for the Scythian and the Norns. However, and this I think I've said in interviews before, because of the way that the first set of Ostenard books were structured, starting with the Dragonbone Chair, which was only the second novel I ever wrote. But my idea was, just as one of the underlying themes of the book was about learning to ask questions, not to take, what was the kind of considered wisdom or the wisdom of the crowd, but to actually find out about things, because, history itself can be untrustworthy. You have to really look into things. And there were a bunch of messages like that. But there was also a lot of messages about culture and cultural differences. And so the combination of those two led me to starting the main character, Simon, in a very European, pseudo-medieval, but very familiar feeling setting. So that as he then moved out into the world, and not just him, but the other central characters, as he moved farther out into the world, he would begin to run into things that were outside his sphere of expertise. And that way it was kind of a model for the journey that we all make into adulthood, including having to go back home again when you finished and realize, what you didn't understand the first time, and looking at things with a different eye. So that was one of the themes. And because of that, I wanted the immortals to feel different right away. So one of the things I did, and there are elements of other, there are elements of the sort of Scandinavian and Celtic fairies in them, but there are also, I think there's some aspects of Bradbury's Martians in them as well, particularly in the coloring, and their general sadness. And, it's impossible to avoid the influence of Tolkien either. But Tolkien himself was utilizing some of these old tropes and folktales. He just picked the ones that he liked, and I did much the same. But anyway, so as a result, I wanted Simon to, once he gets out into the world, to start finding things that are not what he's familiar with and operate differently. So one of the things I did was try to make the Scythi and the Norns feel culturally and even a bit physically different from the more European group of core characters that we started with. That was not because I felt that the core characters, because they were European, were somehow better or more interesting, but it was because we were starting with that more familiar setting, and then things were getting stranger and more unusual as they moved out into the world and had to start learning about things they didn't know about before. So one of the things I did was to pick a slightly kind of Asian feel for the Scythi and also the Norns, but specifically because that is a cultural trope that we connect with as, the readers of predominantly European fantasy or European-esque fantasy, I guess, for lack of a better word. That kind of whole tradition that followed from William Morris and E.R. Edison and Tolkien and, C.S. Lewis and all these folks. So I very deliberately made the Scythi feel different. And in that sense, I used some kind of what I would call signifiers of Asian cultures to immediately make that contrast. Not because I think Asian cultures are magical or because, anything like that. It was purely to give people a very quick, oh, this is different. This Simon has never met anything like this before, or anybody like these people, or anything like this culture. So that's basically what was going on. Anyway, so that's my answer. So no, I hadn't, at that point, I don't think I'd read The Tale of Genji, or Genji, I think Genji. But it definitely, I had read a lot of other Japanese folklore and history and literature and stuff. So, and I think somewhere along the line during the writing of the books, I finally read The Tale of Genji. So that was, that's to answer the question. Anyway, right under that is my mother-in-law. Good morning, Hazel. How are you, sweetie? Good to see you. You see, if you look at the people signing in there, she has the same last name as my wife Deborah. And that's why they're related. Anyway, good to see you, Hazel. Thanks for stopping in. Kristen, hello. I'm glad you're up late. Thanks for joining me. Petra, hello. You and Christine both together in Berlin. Excellent. Thanks for signing in. Jessica, hello, Jessica. How are you? Mahmoud, hello. Good to see you too. From Belgium, no floods. Good. Glad to hear it. Saul, good morning, Saul. Nice to see you too. Chris, we already said hello to. Jeremy, hello, Jeremy. Okay, I think I've got everybody who's signed in. So at this point, I can let me push that back a little bit. At this point, I can probably start reading. Oh, I see. That's what's going on. I actually had my window shrunk. So I can start reading, and that is what I'm going to do, especially after I just spent a long time trying to explain about one of my weird tad things of why I do things the way I do. Because, I can't help it. I'm an explainer by nature. If I hadn't become a writer or something else, in the obviously creative venues of the professional or the commercial art world, going into film or painting or one of the things that I was interested in, music, I probably would have been a teacher, because I think teaching is a holy profession and have a lot of teachers in the family. And I just have this very romantic view of teachers as being people who can introduce, because some of my favorite teachers really made a huge impact on me. Introduced me to biology, introduced me to Shakespeare, introduced me to Bertolt Brecht, all kinds of things that fired me up. So anyway, the last time we were reading, which would have been last Sunday in the 7 p.m. slot, Chert and Beetle Down the Bowman, the tiny little rooftopper guy, had gone down below Funderling Town, following a very thin scent, which Beetle Down had caught, of Flint, Chert's ward, adoptive son, who had disappeared. And that's where they are now. They're down underneath the underside, the caverns underneath Southmarch, and that run deep into the rock on which Southmarch sits. So that's what's going on at the moment. So let me just start here somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where I stopped. So Chert, anyway, is going with Beetle Down on his shoulder, last I remember, down into the place that's the religious heart of the Funderling view of the universe. The murmuring continued all around him. There might have been air currents pushed through the tunnels from the halls above by the tide changing. They were far below the sea now. But Chert thought he could hear snatches of words, sobbing, even distant shouts that raised the hackles on his neck. The Temple Brothers came down here, he reminded himself, and they survived it. But the thought did little. The thought did little to ease his fears. Who knew what preparations they made, what secret sacrifices they gave to the lords of these deep places? He considered the holy mystery of the Earth Elders and the quiet, blind voice, and struggled against growing terror. What was indisputable was that light was growing all around him. Chert could begin to see the shape of the chamber through which they were passing. For the first time in hours, he felt something like hope. They were reaching an area he recognized, a part of the pilgrimage route. A few moments later, as he escaped the treacherous ledge path at last, following it through an arch as it burrowed deep into the stone, the milky blue-white light rose all around them. "Moonstone Hall," Chert announced, with relief, if not much breath. The coolness of the glowing walls, studded with great fractured chunks of palely translucent gemstone, was in strange contrast to the swampy air. "You see, these places down here make their own light. We are near to the center of the mysteries." Beetledown said nothing, only nodded, presumably overcome by the grandeur of the cavern, its walls glowing like smoky blue ice. Chert continued down through the chamber of cloud crystal and into Emberstone Reach, the light like a living thing all around him. His head swimming and eyes dazzled after so long in darkness, he could not help wondering how these great caves could each be so different. It was like no natural place he had seen anywhere else in Southmarch, or in his journeys around Ion in his younger days. But it isn't a natural place, he reminded himself. These are the mysteries. A shiver of superstitious dread climbed his spine. What was he doing here? Caught up in the search for Flint, he hadn't performed even the simplest rituals before descending, said none of the litanies, made not a single offering. The Earth Elders would be furious. It was in Emberstone Reach that he suddenly realized there was a reason for Beetledown's long silence when the little man swayed and tumbled off his shoulder. Chirk caught him and crouched, holding him up to look at him in the light from the orange-gold ember crystals. The gutter scout was alive, but clearly in great discomfort. "Too hot," he said weakly. "Can't get air." Chirk fought a powerful dread. He was so close now. They were only a short distance from the end of the tunnels, at least the end of those parts he and the rest of the Thunderlings knew, and thus only a short distance from Flint, but he didn't want to kill the tiny rooftopper in the act of saving the boy. He forced himself to think as carefully as he could, with head and limbs so weary, then untied the shirt he had tied around his waist when the air got too hot, and made a nest for the little man. He put Beetledown in it and set him on a knob of stone high off the ground. Chirk knew that poison air, even the milder varieties, was heavy and tended to stay low. He also left the little man his coral lantern for company. "I'll be back soon," he said. "I promise. I'm just going down a little farther." He gave the tiny bowman his kerchief, moistened in water, to fight thirst. "Cats?" asked Beetledown weakly. "No cats down here," Chirk assured him. "I already promised you that." "Just in case," the little man said, and sat up. It took much of his strength, then pulled his bow and quiver off and set them down within easy reach, before slumping back into the makeshift bed. Chirk hurried on. He had all the more reason for haste now, not just his worries about the boy, and about Opal, and the dying light of the coral, but also about whether he would repay the kindness of the rooftopper queen and of brave Beetledown himself with the emissary's death. Emberstone Reach ended, and the maze began. He cursed the luck that had brought him into the befuddling labyrinth without the rooftopper and his keen nose, but there was nothing to be done. Chirk remembered something he had been told as a child, at an age when whispering about the initiation was more important than whispering about girls. "Always turn left," his friends had said, with the confidence of those who had not been tested. "When you hit a dead end, turn and backtrack, then do the same thing again with the next tunnel." At their initiation, they had not needed to solve the maze after all. They had been led in by the acolytes, abandoned for a while, and then led out. Now he had no choice but to try the ancient advice, since this time there were no Temple brothers around to help him. Here, between the reach and the sea in the depths, there were also no natural lights, and Chirk had to make his way through the maze in darkness, with only the sound of his own ragged, weary breathing and the thump of his heart for company. After what seemed like an hour, tracing and retracing what to the touch were indistinguishable passages, he finally grew certain he was lost. He was just about to sit down and weep with despair when he felt moving air on his face. Heart pounding now for joy and relief, he followed the breeze a few more turnings until he stepped out of the maze and into the blue-lit vastness of the sea hall. But his happiness lasted only moments. He was on the balcony on the outside of the maze, with a long, fatal drop below him, a barrier so effective that even the pilgrims who completed the mysteries never saw more of the monstrous sea hall cavern than this. There was no way down to the cavern floor, and no sign of Flint on the great raw stone balcony. There was nowhere else the boy could be. Now, Chirp did weep a little, exhausted and despondent. He got down on his knees and crawled close to the edge, half certain that he would see the boy's mangled body on the jagged, rocky shore beneath him, illuminated by the weird blue crystals of the cavern's roof. Instead, the reach of broken piled stone was empty all the way to the silvery sea in the depths, and the unreachable island at its center, where the vast rocky form stood that figured in so many Funderling nightmares and revelations. The man-shaped formation was shrouded in shadow, but the roof stones shed their light almost everywhere else. There was no sign of Flint, either living or dead. Chirp was plunged back into the misery of uncertainty. Had he and Beetledown walked right past Flint at some other turning, not knowing that the boy lay senseless or even dead nearby? The mysteries and the tunnels and caves above them were unimaginably complex. How could he even guess where to start a new search if the rooftopper's nose was not to be trusted? Then, as if it had sensed Chirp's distant presence, the huge and mysterious stone figure known as the Shining Man began to flicker a light on the island at the center of the sea in the depths, and Chirp's heart sped until he thought it might burst. He had seen the statue only one other time, at his initiation, in the company of other young Funderlings under the guidance of the metamorphic brothers. This time he was alone and full of an interloper's guilt. As the massive crystalline shape suddenly blazed with blue and purple and golden light, it threw strange reflections on the sea itself, which was not water, but an immense pool of something like quicksilver, so that all the cavern was full of leaping colors, and the Shining Man almost appeared to move, as if awakening from a long slumber. Chirp flung himself down, his belly against the stone. He begged the Earth Elders forgiveness and prayed to be spared. The gods did not see fit to strike him dead, and after a few moments the light dimmed a little, enough that he dared to raise his head, but when he did so, Chirp's superstitious terror was suddenly made worse. In the new light he could see a small shape on the island, a moving figure that advanced, crawling slowly upward from the edge of the shining metal sea toward the feet of the glowing giant, the Shining Man. Even from this distance, with the figure small as an insect, Chirp knew who it was. "Flint!" he shouted, and his voice echoed out across the quicksilver sea, but the small shadow did not stop or even look back. Chapter 30, Awakening. Red leaves. The child in its bed. A bear on a hilltop. 2 pearls taken from the hand of an old one. From the Bonefall Oracles. The ceiling of the main trigonate temple was so high that even with the great doors closed, it had its own subtle winds. The thousands of candles on altars and in alcoves were all flickering. At this hour of the morning, it was also very cold. Barrick's arm ached. The Prince Regent was surrounded by the men who would accompany him into the west. His unloved cousin, Rorik Longaran, and more proven warriors, like Tyne of Blueshore, and Tyne's old friend, the extravagantly mustached Droy Nicomedy of Eastlake, along with many others Barrick knew mostly by reputation. In fact, much of the flower of the March Kingdom's nobility had gathered for this blessing. Doughty Main Callow from far Kirkwall, Sidney Fiddix, who some called the Piecemeal Knight, because his armor and battle array were all prizes he had won in various tilts, Earl Gowan Mardall of Helmingsea, and several dozen other high lords dressed in white robes, plus 5 or 6 times that number of humbler stature, who yet possessed their own horses and armor and at least a cottage or field somewhere so they could call themselves landed. Like all the others, Beric Eden was down on one knee, facing the altar where Sisel told the blessing, the ancient Hierosoline phrases rolling from the hierarch's tongue like the meaningless babble of a fast-running stream. Beric knew he would soon be riding to war, perhaps even to death. Not only that, the enemy they all faced were the wild creatures from the Shadowlands, the old terror, the stuff of nightmares. Yet he felt oddly flat, empty, and unconcerned. He raised his eyes to the vast tripartite statue behind the altar, the three gods of the Trigon, standing atop an artfully carved stone plinth that became clouds around the sky god's feet, stones and waves respectively for the gods of earth and sea. The three towering deities stared outward, with Perrin in the center in his rightful place as the highest of the high, fish-scaled Erebor on his right, glowering Kernios on his left. They were half-brothers, all children of old Spheros, the night sky, from different mothers. Beric wondered if any one of the Trigon would be willing to die for his brothers, as he would give his life for Bryony, as he almost certainly was going to give his life for her. But since they were gods, and thus immortal and invulnerable, how would such a thing happen? How could gods be brave? Hierarch Sisel was still droning. The old man had insisted on leading the ceremony himself because of the importance of the occasion, and because, Beric suspected, like so many others, he wished to do something to help, to feel himself a contributor. Word had passed swiftly through castle and city. There was not one person in 100 now who did not know that war was coming, and that it was apparently going to be a strange and frightening sort of war as well. How Beric himself felt about it all was even stranger, he had to admit. Like reaching for something on a high shelf that was just out of reach, no matter how one jumped or strained. He simply couldn't make himself feel much of anything. When the hierarch's part of the ceremony was over, Sisel took Beric aside as the other nobles were having their robes perfumed with sacred smoke by the blue-clad temple mantises. The hierarch had a half-humble, half-irritated expression that Beric knew very well. It was a look his elders often wore when they wanted to scold him, but couldn't help remembering that one or two of Beric's ancestors had imprisoned people or even killed them, if certain unpopular rumors were true, for giving unwelcome advice. It is a brave thing you are doing, my prince, Sisel said. He means to say stupid, Beric decided. But of course that was a word even a hierarch of the Trigonate would not use to an enthroned prince. I have my reasons, Eminence. Some of them are good ones. Sisel raised his hand. It was meant to signify no more needs to be said, but to Beric it was irritatingly close to Shazot's raised hand, which throughout his childhood usually meant, "Shut up, boy." Of course, Highness, of course. And the three powerful ones grant that you and the others come home safely. Tyne is to lead, of course. His forehead wrinkled as he realized what he had said. In support of you, of course, Prince Beric. He almost smiled. Of course. But let us be honest, I'm to be a sort of, what do they have on the front of a ship? A masthead? Figurehead? Yes. I don't expect the soldiers to listen to me, hierarch. I have no experience of war yet. In fact, I hope to learn something from Tyne and the others. If the three grant I come back safely, that is. Sisel gave him a strange look. He had perhaps detected something a little false in Beric's pious manner, but he was also relieved and clearly didn't want to think about it much. You show great wisdom, my prince. You are unquestionably your father's son. Yes, I think that's true. Sizel was still puzzled by whatever lurked beneath Beric's words. These are not natural creatures we face, my prince. We should not be troubled at what we do. We? Beric thought. What do you mean? These things, the twilight people, as they are superstitiously named, the old ones, they are unnatural, the enemies of men. They would take what is ours. They must be destroyed like rats or locusts without compunction. Beric could only nod. Rats. Locusts. He let himself be sensed. The perfumes and the smoke reminded him of the spice stalls of Market Square, made him wish badly to be there again, with Bryony, as when they were children and had escaped for a delicious giggling moment or two with half the household in ragged pursuit. After he had removed the ceremonial robe, Beric followed the knights and nobles out of the temple. Tyne Aldrich and the others looked rested and refreshed, as though they had just come from a bath and a nap, and Beric couldn't help being jealous that the trip to the temple had given them this comfort, a comfort he himself did not feel. Earl Tyne saw Beric's troubled face and slowed until they were walking side by side. The gods will protect us, never fear, Prince Beric. The creatures are uncanny things, but they are real. They are made of flesh. When we cut them, their blood will flow. How can you be sure of that? He wanted to ask. After all, the only person in all of Southmarch with any experience of their enemy was that soldier Vanson, who had actually been present for the killing of one of the Shadowline creatures, although admittedly a small and not very dangerous one, and who had also been attacked by a much larger thing that half a dozen soldiers had not managed to harm at all, even as it took one of their company, like a child snatching a sweetmeat from an unguarded plate. Beric did not share any of these thoughts either. The monsters will be frightening, no doubt, said Tyne quietly. They paused as the temple acolytes pushed open the heavy bronze doors and let the bay air spill in, ruffling hair and clothing, and making the candle flames sputter. Remember, Highness, it is important that we show the men a courageous face. The gods will give us what courage we need, no doubt. Yes, said Tyne, nodding vigorously. They did for me when I was a youth. Beric suddenly realized that although Tyne Aldrich was more than twice Beric's own age, he was still a great deal younger than the twins' father, King Olin. He was a man still young enough to have ambitions. Perhaps he hoped that Beric would remember him as a loyal friend and mentor if they all survived, that his fortune would rise even higher if Beric Eden became king someday. Tyne's daughter was nearly of marriageable age, after all. Perhaps he dreamed of a royal connection. Up until this moment, it had been hard for Beric to think of most of his elders as anything other than an undifferentiated mass, at least those who were not yet dodderingly old. Now, for the first time, he examined the battle-scarred Earl of Blueshore and wondered what Tyne himself saw when he gazed out at the world, what he thought and hoped and feared. Beric looked around at Sibney Fiddix and Ivar of Silverside and the other lords, faces held up, jaws set in expressions meant to be brave and inspiring as the pale sunshine spilled in through the open doors, and realized that every one of these men lived inside his own head, just as Beric lived in his, and that all of the hundreds of people waiting anxiously on the stairs outside the temple for a glimpse of the nobility of Southmarch lived within their own thoughts as well, as completely and separately as Beric himself did. It's as if we live on 1,000 different islands in the middle of an ocean, he thought, but with no boats. We can see each other, we can shout to each other, but we can none of us leave our own island and travel to another. This idea hit him with a far stronger force than any of the rituals he had just experienced inside the temple, and so he did not realize for a moment that the crowd of people on the steps was pushing the ring of guards back toward the temple doors, that in their fear over the rumors of war and even more terrifying things, the throng of common folk was only moments away from trampling the very people they expected to defend them. Some of the priests began to shut the great doors again. The guards were shoving back with the long handles of their pikes, and a few of the crowd were knocked down and bruised. A woman screamed. Some men began trying to pull the pikes away from the guards. A few clods of dirt thudded down on the steps, and one hit a Marinswalk baron on the leg, and he stared dumbfounded at the stain on his clean hose as though it were blood. Rorik shouted in alarm, perhaps as much at the threat to his own cleanliness as the danger to his person. Then, as if it happened in a dream, he was still caught up in the idea of people as islands, Beric watched Tyne draw his sword, heard the rattle and hiss of a dozen blades leaving their scabbards as other nobles followed Blue Shore's lead. The smell of the crowd so close around them was an animal reek, alien and frightening. Tyne and the others, they're going to kill people, he realized. It scarcely seemed possible it was happening so swiftly. Or the people may kill us. But why? He looked at the faces around him, saw a growing realization reflected between the nobles and commons that things were falling to pieces, and that none of them knew how to stop it. But I can, he realized. It was a heady feeling, although oddly cheerless. He raised his good hand and walked down a few steps. Tyne snatched at him, but Beric ducked away. "Stop!" he cried, but no one could hear his words above the shouting of frightened people. Most of the faces staring up at the temple portico couldn't even see him. He turned and bounded back up the steps to where the massive bronze doors still stood halfway open. One of the cleverer priests, perhaps Sizel himself, had realized it would not be a good idea to lock out the Prince Regent and the other nobles while they were surrounded by a furious mob. Then he yanked a pike away from one of the nearest guardsmen, who surrendered it with a look of complete confusion and misery, as though he suspected that for some inscrutable princely reason Beric was about to strike him with his own weapon. Instead, Beric used the heavy pike head to pound against the bronze door until the raw echoes flew across the yard. Heads turned, and the shouting slowly began to diminish. Beric was breathing very hard. It was difficult to wield the pike with only one hand, bracing it under his arm to hammer at the door, but it had worked. Most of the crowd stared open-mouthed at their young prince in front of the temple doorway. "What do you want?" he cried. "Do you want to crush us? We are going out to fight for the city, for our land. In the holy name of the three, what do you think you're doing, pressing in on us like this?" Some of those caught up with the guards stepped back, shamefaced, but others were more entangled. The process of undoing the near riot was as complicated as unpicking delicate stitchery. A guardsman, still grappling with a sullen onlooker, overbalanced and fell with a clang of armor, and several of his fellow guards moved forward angrily. Beric raised his voice again. "Stop! Let the people tell me. What do you want?" "If you and the other lords go, Prince Beric, who'll protect the city?" a man shouted. "The fairy folk will come and take our children," cried someone else, a woman. Beric made a show of his confident smile. It was strange how easily this kind of thing came to him, this useful duplicity. "Who will protect the city? The city is protected by Bren's Bay, which is worth more than any knights, even these fine nobles. Look around you. If you were a warlord, even the warlord of a fairy army, would you want to come up that causeway and against these high walls? And don't forget, my sister Bryony will still be here, and Eden on the throne. Believe me, even the Twilight people don't want to get her angry. A few of the people laughed, but others were still calling out anxious questions. Tyne Aldridge made a show of sheathing his sword. Please, Beric said to the crowd, let us get on with this day's work. We are to ride soon. Avon Brone, the Lord Constable, will come back here and speak at midday to tell you of how we will defend the castle and the city, what each of you can do to help. The three bless you, Prince Beric, a woman called, and the pained hope in her voice was real enough to touch him, even to frighten him. Come home safe to us. Other blessings and good wishes rained down. A moment before it had been clumps of dirt and even a few stones. The crowd didn't disperse, but they opened a path so that Beric and the rest of the knights could head back toward the Raven Gate and the inner keep. You handled that well, Highness. Tyne sounded a little surprised. The gods told you the right words to say. I am an Eden. They know my family. They know we do not lie to them. But he couldn't help wondering, did I truly do that? Or did the gods indeed work through me? I felt no god, that's all I know. In truth, he was not certain how he felt at all. Proud that he had quelled an anxious mob and given them hope, or distressed by how easily they could be swayed from one extreme to another. And we are not even truly at war. Not yet. He had a sudden chill of presentiment. What will it be like when things begin to go bad? And where will the gods be then? The noise of hammers was almost deafening, as though a flock of monstrous woodpeckers had descended on Southmarch Castle. Men clambered on every wall and tower, it seemed, putting up wooden hoardings against the possibility of a siege. After the torpor that had gripped the castle in the past months, it was almost a relief to see so much activity. But Bryony knew this was no mere attack from a neighboring kingdom against which they must defend themselves. The March kingdoms were at war with a completely unknown and perhaps unknowable enemy. When the men on the walls and towers looked out toward the still innocent western horizon, and they looked often, the fear on their faces was plain even from the ground. Not only the workers found their attention compromised. The Princess Regent was so busy watching the work that she stumbled into a low boxwood hedge. Rose and Moina hurried forward to help her, but she shook them off, murmuring angrily. These cursed hedges! How can a person even walk? Sister Uta appeared in one of the gallery archways. Despite the cool gray skies, she wore only a light wrap over her plain gown. A wimple of the same color covered her hair, so that her handsome face seemed almost to hang in the air like a mask on a wall. It would be hard to make a knot garden without hedges, the Zorian sister said gently. I hope you haven't hurt yourself, Highness. I'm well, I suppose. Bryony rubbed at her lower leg. She had discovered one of the disadvantages of wearing hose like a man. There was nothing to protect her shins from pokes and bumps. Uta seemed to know what the Princess Regent was thinking. In any case, she smiled. It was kind of you to visit me. Not kind. I'm miserable. I have no one to talk to. She looked up in time to catch the hurt glance that jumped from Moina to Rose. No one but these two, she said hastily, and I have complained to them so much that they are surely tired of hearing my voice. Never, Highness. Rose said it in such a clattering hurry to make her feel better that Bryony almost laughed. Now she knew that they were tired of listening to her. We worry for you, Bryony, that's all, Moina agreed, and by forgetting to use her mistress's title, she proved that she was speaking the truth. They are good and kind, these girls, she thought, and for a moment felt herself old enough to be their grown sister, Even their mother, although small yellow-haired Rose was her own age, and dark Moina almost a full year her elder. "How is your great aunt?" asked Uda. "Marilana, feeling better. With these musters of soldiers marching in and all these guests in the castle, she is in her element, like a sea captain in a storm. She's been looking in on my stepmother, too, since Anissa's time is close and Chavin has seen fit to disappear." It was hard for Bryony to keep her anger at the physician to a polite growl. Finished brushing the bits of boxwood off her hose and the bottom of her tunic, she straightened up. The smell of hyssop, and especially lavender, were strong here, despite the cold breeze off the bay, but they were not soothing. She wondered if anything would soothe her at all. She wondered if anything would soothe her. "And you, sister, are you well?" "My joints are sore. It always happens when the wind freshens. If you wish to go in out of the garden, I will not complain. I can barely hear you with all this clattering anyway, and it won't be better anywhere else. It won't be better anywhere else out of doors. Where shall we go?" "I was about to go to the shrine and make an offering for the safety of your brother and the rest. It is quiet there. What do you think?" "I think that would be lovely," Bryony told her. "Rose, Moina, stop making eyes at those men on the wall and come along." The castle's Zorian shrine had none of the ostentation of the Erebor chapel, let alone the huge and grand trigonate temple. Little more than a single large room, it stood in a corner of the keep near the residence, just below the Tower of Summer. The altar was simple, and only one small stained glass window brought in the daylight, a rendition crafted in the previous century of Zoria, with her arms outstretched and seabirds landing on her hands and flying about her head. It was a strangely beautiful picture, Bryony had always thought, and even in today's poor sunlight, the colors glowed. The shrine was empty, although Bryony knew that an older Zorian priestess and at least 2 or 3 young novices lived in the apartment beside the chapel. They were Uda's friends, her family, really, since her true kin were far away in the Vutish Isles, and far in the past as well. "When did you last see any of your family?" she asked her tutor. "Your blood family?" Uda appeared startled by the question. "My brother visited me here once some years ago. Before that, oh, my Princess Bryony, I have not seen any of them since I joined the sisters." Which must have been 30 years or more, Bryony guessed. "Don't you miss them?" "I miss the time when I was young. I miss the sense of being in that house, on that island, and feeling that it was the center of the whole world. I miss how I felt about my mother then, although later I came to feel differently." She bowed her head for a moment. "Yes, I do, I suppose." Bryony thought it strange to have to consider whether you missed your family. She hid her puzzlement in the act of choosing and lighting a candle and setting it on the altar before the statue of Zoria. This version of the goddess was much more staid than the one in the colorful window. Her arms hung at her side and her eyes were cast down, as though she looked at her own feet. But there was a faint smile on her lips that Bryony had always liked, the smile of a woman who kept her own counsel. Moina and Rose came forward and lit candles also, although they both seemed a little confused and made the 3-fingered sign of the trigon over their breasts as they set the candles down. They were doing their best, Bryony reminded herself, fighting annoyance. They were both girls from country families and had barely been exposed to Zoria's worship or sisterhood at all until coming to live in Southmarch Castle. "Merciful Zoria, robed in wisdom, bring my brother Barrett home safe," Bryony prayed silently. "Bring them all back safe, even Guard Captain Vanson. He's not such a bad man." and help me do what is best for Southmarch and her people." She looked up, hoping to see something in Zoria's face that would tell her the goddess had heard her and would honor her request. She was the Princess Regent, after all. Didn't that count for something? But the serene features of Perrin's virgin daughter were unchanged. She suddenly remembered. "And bring father home safe again from Hyrosol." She had prayed for that thing every day, but today she had almost forgotten. A quick chill moved over her. Did it mean anything? Was a god whispering to her, trying to tell her something had happened to him? Could it be her fault? Had she shown too much pride in her own abilities as ruler of Southmarch? "I hoped this place would bring you some peace, Princess," said her tutor. "But you look troubled." "Oh, Uda, how could I look otherwise?" Brother and sister were silent as they rode down the causeway, across Bren's Bay, toward the great field where the mustered soldiers had been quartered. A swath of harvested land an hour's ride distant, at the southernmost edge of Avonbrone's fiefdom of Land's End. The day was cold and clear, but the wind was rising. It wrapped the new cloak Marilana had embroidered for him around Barrett's neck in a strangler's grip. He grunted as he used his crippled arm to free himself, but still did not speak. He knew Bryony wanted him to, but he did not want to hear what she would say in turn. He had heard it enough times already. From the center of the causeway, they could see that the low-tide shallows and mud flats at the base of the castle mount were full of workers, almost another army it seemed, swarming above the mud on makeshift platforms. They had demolished the ramshackle market town before the gate, and now were pulling apart the stones of the causeway itself beneath the castle walls, preparing to replace it with a wooden bridge that could be torn down in moments, thus completely cutting the castle off from the land and forcing any invader to ride over sucking mud with water up to the horses' necks, or else find a way to get boats across the bay's tricky currents under fire from the walls when the tide came back in. Little wonder, Barrett reflected, that Erebor of the dark seas had always been held the special patron of the Edens. Who else but the sea god had given them this almost unconquerable vantage? "Bryony and the others will be safe here no matter what," he told himself. His twin didn't seem to be sharing his thought, but gnawed at her lower lip in the way she did when she was worrying about something, a habit carried over from childhood so completely it almost seemed a cherished memento. He followed the line of her sight. The captain of the guard, Vanson, was riding a short distance to the side of them. Barrett felt a touch of jealousy, although he knew it was absurd. She still hates that one, he thought. Loathes him to the point of unfairness, as if it were all his fault Kendrick died. They rode in silence for a long time, so that Barrett was almost drowning in his saddle when his sister finally spoke. "Sorry." They rode in silence for a long time, so that Barrack was almost drowsing in his saddle when his sister finally spoke, and at first he could make no sense of her words. "He won't defend the city." "Who? What city?" "Avonbrone," she said, as if the name tasted bad. "The rest of Southmarch, of course, the mainland. He said that the walls are too long and too low on the inland side, and it's too hard to defend." "He's right. How would we do it?" Barrack pointed to the thicket of gabled roofs, stretching away down the coastline and outward as far as the base of the hills. He was grateful to be distracted from his own heavy thoughts, but it seemed odd to be talking with his sister about such things, as though they were playing with being adults. "I don't know," she said, "but we can't possibly get all those people inside the keep." "The gods save us, no, we bloody well can't, Bryony. You couldn't get a quarter of them into the castle and have room for them to sit down, let alone feed them all. So we should just abandon them if there's a siege?" "We have to hope there won't be a siege. Because if there is, we'll have to do more than leave those people to fend for themselves. We'll have to burn that part of the city down. What? Just to keep the besiegers from getting their hands on the stores there? And the wood, and everything else that we don't destroy? As it is, we will probably have to stand by while the catapults throw the stones of our own city onto us. You don't know that, and neither does Avon Brome. Her anger seemed mostly sadness. Nobody knows anything. There hasn't been any siege of proper cities in the marchlands for 100 years. I heard Father talk about it once. Some people say there won't ever be again because of cannons and bombards and all those other things that blow stones and metal balls through the air. There's no point. It annoyed Barrack to be told things about war by his sister. It annoyed him even more that she had clearly been paying more attention than he had. No point? So what should we do? Just surrender? That's not what I meant, and you know it. The hour wore on as they rode in silence up the coast road into the lower reaches of Land's End. The chill air carried little except the clean tang of the pines and the ever-present smell of the sea. Brian, he finally said, we can't be certain it will be a siege, Barrack. We don't even know what these twilight creatures plan. They're not men. They're something else. Only the gods can guess what they'll do. We'll have an idea soon enough. If they've marched into Daler's Trough, we'll meet people who know something about them and how they fight. We'll send you back word as soon as we hear anything. She turned abruptly to face him. Oh, Barrack, you will be careful, won't you? I'm so angry with you. I don't want you to go. He felt himself stiffen. I'm old enough to decide for myself. But that doesn't mean it's right. She stared, shook her head. I'm frightened for you. Don't let's argue anymore. Just don't do anything foolish, please. No matter what dreams you have, what you fear. The cold heaviness that had cast a shadow over him all day was abruptly pierced by a shaft of regret and love. He looked at his sister, her oh so familiar face, his own face, but seen in a bright mirror, open where he was pinched and hidden, golden and pink where he was angry, blood red and corpse pale, and wished that things had turned out a different way. For just as he had been struck earlier that day by the powerful certainty that some unstoppable downward slide had begun, so also he couldn't help feeling deeply, wordlessly, that he and his beloved twin, his best and perhaps only friend, would never again be together in this way. The certainty hit him now, like a blow in the stomach. A gulf would open between them, something wide and deep. Was it death, whose cold breath he could almost feel, or something stranger still? Whatever it was, he began to shudder, and it quickly became so strong that he could barely stay upright in his saddle. Suddenly he pitched forward, falling down some dark tunnel, flailing away into a nothingness where a cold, knowing presence awaited him. Barrack! He heard her terrified voice as if from the other side of a crowded, noisy room. Barrack! What's wrong? The roaring in his ears eased a bit. The gray day returned and pushed back the darkness. He was leaning low over his saddle, his head almost on his horse Kettle's neck. I'm well enough. Leave me alone. A measure of Bryony's fright was that she had seized his crippled arm. He snatched it back and straightened up. No one around them seemed to be staring, but he could tell by the studied way in which they were all looking at anything except the prince and his sister that they had only just averted their eyes. The gods make a mockery of us, he said quietly. His attention distracted by his near swoon, he had failed to notice that they had arrived at the field. The mustard men were waiting below them in ragged array among the shorn stalks of grain, 1,000 or more of the earliest arrivals who had been chivied into lines by their sergeants, but still did not look much like an army. More men streamed in every day from the provinces, but instead of joining this westbound company, most of the newcomers would bolster the defenses of Southmarch itself. "Don't say such things about the gods," Brian pleaded. "Not when you are about to go away. I can't bear it." He looked at her and, despite his shame and misery, felt a thump of love for her in his chest. After all, what else did he have in this world? What else did he fear to lose? Nothing. He reached out and patted her hands where they clutched the reins of her horse, Snow. "You're right, Strawhead. I'm sorry, and I don't mean it. I don't believe the gods are mocking us." And he was telling the truth. For in this open place, beneath this low, gray sky, Beric had suddenly decided that he did not believe in the gods at all. And that's where we're stopping for tonight. Hooray! And I hardly had any coughing fits. It's not, there's nothing wrong. I've discovered that, especially at night, it's worse at the late night reading, that reading characters, especially characters down in the lower range where you're doing that kind of vocal fry thing, irritates the voice. Anyway, but I think it's only fair because after spending an hour with my voice irritating you, it should irritate me as well. Fair is fair. Anyway, with that, I am going to thank you for joining me, as I always do, because I always feel thankful. And remind you that we're still fighting the pandemic. And that's one of the reasons I'm still reading. So all of you take care of yourselves. Don't get cocky. Don't get confident, or you'll get lazy, and then you might get dead. Keep up the good work. Strive to take good care of yourself, your loved ones, your friends and neighbors, anybody that you can help. And that's about it. I'll be back at 7 p.m. To read some more for those of you who are in a proximate time zone or whatever, or in at least a convenient time zone. And other than that, all I want to say is ciao bella, ciao bambini. Nice to see you, and y'all be good, and I'll see you tomorrow. Or, if not tomorrow, I'll see you next week.